Tales from the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens.
Here's a health to the king and a lasting peace. May action end and wealth increase.
It looks to me like a Cupid's belly.
Let us drink while we have breath, for there's no drinking after death. And he who woman's health deny.
I think not, sir.
Down among the dead men, down among the dead men.
Blood and thunder!
Down, 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 down. Down among the dead men, let him lie.
Ah!
The story of Jack Martin and his magical Scottish coach journey. Jack Martin was one of the most merry, pleasant and clever fellows that ever lived. A salesman from the firm Tiggin and Whelps, every autumn he made a business pilgrimage, travelling from London to Edinburgh and Edinburgh to Glasgow, before going back the way he had come. His return visit to Edinburgh was purely for his own pleasure. Staying for a week, he would look up old friends. And what with each day filled with much breakfasting, lunching, dining and supping, he used to make a pretty tight week of it.
One night, just prior to his departure for London, Jack dined at the house of a very old friend. This man was called Bailey McSomething or other. He lived in the old town of Edinburgh. Present at the supper were the Bailey's wife, 3 daughters and grown-up son. There were also 3 or 4 stout, bushy-eyed, canny old Scots fellows. These the Bailey had gathered together to do honour to Jack and help make a night of it. It was a glorious meal, with kippered salmon, finnan haddock and a lamb's head. There was also a haggis, which, when it came to table, Jack proclaimed,
It looks to me like a Cupid's belly.
The lasses were pretty and agreeable, and the Bailey's wife one of the best creatures that ever lived. Jack was in thoroughly good form, the consequence of which was that the young ladies tittered and giggled. The old lady laughed out loud, and the Bailey and his Scots fellows roared till they were red in the face, particularly after the uncountable number of whisky toddies that were consumed after the meal.
Well, he who would himself deny.
At 1 o'clock in the morning, the grown-up son keeled over while attempting the first verse of a song. Taking his place, Jack mixed himself another glass of toddy and rose to make a toast.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you my great friend, the Bailey!
It occurred to him then that it was almost time to think about going in order to get home at a decent hour. Taking a drop more of whisky, neat this time to prevent the toddy disagreeing with him, he lay violent hands on his hat and sallied forth into the street.
It was a wild and gusty night. The clouds were drifting over the moon at their giddiest speed, with alternating bursts of splendid light and shrouded darkness. Jack seemed personally offended by the weather.
Really? This won't do. This is not at all the kind of thing for my trip. It will not do at any price.
Having repeated this several times, he recovered his balance with some difficulty and walked merrily on.
On either side of him, tall, gaunt, struggling houses with time-stained fronts shot up against the black sky. They had windows that seemed like old men's eyes, grown dim and sunken with age. 6, 7, 8 stories high. These houses threw their shadows over the roughly paved road, making the dark night even darker. Jack strode up the middle of the street with a thumb in each waistcoat pocket, glancing at these things with an air of a man who had seen them too often before. He was singing with such spirit that the quiet, honest folk started from their sleep.
Oh, you shut up!
Keeping to the middle of the road, he looked as if he would very much like to meet with somebody who would dispute him possession of it with him.
Down among the dead men, let him Lie!
When Jack reached the end of Leith Walk, he had to cross a large piece of waste ground to reach his lodgings. At the time, there was on this piece of ground an enclosure belonging to a wheelwright. This man contracted with the post office for the purchase of old, worn-out mail coaches. Being very fond of such coaches, Jack took it into his head to peep between the gaps in the fence. There were about a dozen vehicles huddled together in a most desolate condition. Doors had been torn from hinges and removed, linings stripped off, lamps were gone and poles vanished. The ironwork was rusty from worn-away paint. The wind whistled through chinks in the bare woodwork. These were the decaying skeletons of departed males. And in that lonely place, at that time of night, they looked chill and dismal.
Jack rested his head on his hands and thought of the busy, bustling people who, years before, had rattled about in these coaches. The people who these now cracked and mouldering vehicles had carried, night after night for many years through all weathers. At the postman's knock, he thought of the merchant, the lover, wife, widow, mother and schoolboy, or the child who tottered to the door in expectation of mail. How they had all looked forward to the arrival of the old coaches.
And in this contemplation, he fell into a kind of doze. For how long, he did not know. This was suddenly disturbed by some deep church bells striking 2. At that instant, the whole of this deserted and quiet spot became a scene of most extraordinary life and animation. The mail coach doors were back on their hinges, lining was replaced, ironwork as good as new, paint restored, and lamps brightly alight. Cushions and greatcoats were on every coach box.
Porters were thrusting parcels into every boot. Guards stowed away letter bags. Ostlers were dashing pails of water against the renovated wheels. Passengers arrived, luggage was handed up, and horses put to.
Now then,
Jack felt a hand on his shoulder.
you're booked for one inside. You'd better get in.
Me? Booked?
Yes, certainly.
Jack was dumbfounded, not least by the fact that he could not tell where the crowd of people that poured in at every moment came from. They seemed to appear in some strange manner from the ground or the air and disappear in the same way.
When a porter put his luggage in the coach and received his fare, he turned round and was immediately gone, to be quickly followed by half a dozen others, staggering under the weight of parcels which seemed big enough to crush them. The passengers were all dressed so oddly too, with large, broad-skirted lace coats, great cuffs, no collars, and wigs. Great formal ones with a tie behind.
Well, I'll be jiggered.
Now, are you going to get in?
The mail guard had a lantern in one hand, which he held to Jack's face. In the other, he had a huge blunderbuss gun, which he was going to stow in his little arm chest.
Are you going to get in, Jack Martin?
Hello? That's a bit familiar.
It's on the way bill.
Isn't there a Mr. before it?
No, there is not.
Is the fare paid?
Of course it is.
It is it? Then here goes. Which coach?
This one.
The guard pointed to an old-fashioned Edinburgh and London vehicle.
Stop! Here are the other passengers. Let them get in first.
As the guard spoke, a young gentleman appeared in a powdered wig and sky-blue, silver-trimmed coat lined with buckram. Being in the cloth business, Jack knew all the materials at once. This man also wore knee breeches, silk stockings, and had a 3-cornered hat on his head with a long taper sword by his side.
This gentleman stalked gravely to the coach door, pulled off his hat, and held it above his head at arm's length. He cocked his little finger in the air, as some affected people do when they take a cup of tea. Then, drawing both feet together, he made a low bow and offered his hand. Jack was about to step forward and shake it heartily when he saw that these attentions were actually directed to a young lady who arrived at the foot of the steps. She wore an old-fashioned green velvet dress and was muffled in a black silk hood. She looked around for a moment before getting into the coach. This revealed the most beautiful face that Jack had ever seen. But in this one glimpse, He saw an imploring look that betrayed her terror and distress.
Get in!
Jack noticed too that this young fellow in the powdered wig clasped her tightly by the wrist as she entered the carriage and followed her quickly.
There was a final member of this party, an uncommonly mean-looking man. He wore a close brown wig, plum-coloured suit, boots up to his hips, and had a very large sword. When he sat himself down next to the young lady, she shrank into a corner. This confirmed to Jack that something dark and mysterious was going forward. As he entered the coach, he quickly made up his mind to help the lady at any cost if she needed it. Suddenly, as Jack entered the coach, the plum-suited man drew his sword and lunged at Jack.
Blood and thunder! Gah!
With great dexterity, our hero snatched the hat from the man's head and, receiving the sword point through the crown, he squeezed the sides together, holding it tight as the gentleman shouted to his companion,
Pick him from behind!
You better not! I'll kick his brains out if he hasn't, and fracture his skull if he hasn't!
Exerting all his strength, Jack wrenched the ill-looking man's sword from his grasp and flung it clean out of the window.
Death and lightning!
The younger gentleman went for his sword in a very fierce manner, but did not draw it. After a short, tense silence, Jack took his seat, slowly and deliberately.
Now, gentlemen, I don't want to have any death with or without lightning in a lady's presence. We've had quite enough blood and thundering for one journey. So, if you please, we'll sit in our places. Here, guard, pick up that gentleman's carving knife.
Immediately, the guard appeared at the window with the sword in his hand. He held up his lantern, looking earnestly into Jack's face, and handed it in. By its light, Jack saw to his great surprise an immense crowd of male guards swarming around the window, all with eyes fixed on him. He had never seen such a sea of white faces, red bodies, and earnest eyes in all his days.
This is the strangest sort of thing I've ever had to deal with. Allow me to return you your hat, sir.
The plum-suited gentleman received his hat in near silence. Peering at the hole in the middle, with great solemnity he stuck it on top of his wig, an effect which was ruined by a sudden violent fit of sneezing.
All right!
At the guard's cry, they set off. As they travelled, Jack's thoughts were occupied with the young lady, who sat in the farthest corner of the coach with her face muffled. The two gentlemen sat beside her and opposite, both watching her intently in the gloom of the coach's interior. If she so much as ruffled the folds of her hood, he could hear the ill-looking man clap hand upon his sword. In the darkness, the other man's shadow looked as big as if he were going to devour her at a mouthful. This roused Jack more and more. He was determined to see the end of it.
Dashed blowy nights, don't you think? I wonder where we shall stop first. Why can't we go any faster?
All such attempts to attract the lady's attention or engage the mysterious men in conversation were in vain. They wouldn't talk, and she dare not. All of a sudden, the coach stopped.
Hello? What's in the wind now?
A light here!
Here?
Here!
I'll do nothing of the sort.
Very well then. Stop where you are.
I will.
Good!
The other passengers had listened to this conversation with great attention. Finding that Jack was determined not to alight, the younger man squeezed past him to hand the lady out. At this moment, the plum-suited man was inspecting the hole in his hat. So, as the young lady brushed past, she dropped one of her gloves, unseen, into Jack's hand and whispered,
Help!
Her lips were so close to his face that he felt the warm breath on his nose. Immediately, Jack leapt out of the coach at once with such violence that it rocked on its springs.
Oh, You've thought better of it, have you?
I could wrench that blunderbuss from him, fire it at that cove with the big sword, knock the other one over the head with the stock, and disappear in the gunsmoke with the lady.
On a set of very quick second thoughts, he abandoned such a melodramatic plan and followed the two mysterious men, with the lady between them, who were now entering an old house. It was the most ruined and desolate place he had ever seen. It looked as though it had once been a large house of entertainment, but the roof had collapsed in many places. They entered a room that contained a huge fireplace. White, burnt wood dust was strewn all over the hearth that was dark and gloomy.
Well, a mail coach travelling at a rate of 6.5 miles an hour and stopping for an indefinite time at a hole such as this is rather an irregular sort of proceeding, I fancy. This shall be made known. I will write to the newspapers.
Neither of the gentlemen took any notice of this speech. Instead, they whispered at each other and scowled at him. At the far end of the room, the attractive lady ventured to wave her hand as if to attract his attention.
Come on, help me, please.
At length, the two strangers advanced a little.
You do know this is a private room, I suppose, fellow?
No, I do not, fellow.
Leave this room now.
Eh?
Quit this room, or you are a dead man.
Run him through!
No!
All the time he had appeared so indifferent to what was going on, Jack had been looking about for some weapon of defence. As swords were drawn, he spotted in the chimney corner an old basket-handled rapier in a rusty scabbard. At one bound, he caught it in his hand and drew it.
Come on, fellow.
The noise of combat was terrific. At its height, the lady withdrew her hood entirely from her face, to reveal such stunning beauty that Jack would have fought against 50 men. Now he began to power away like a raving giant. This was indeed impressive for a man whose only experience of sword in hand was when he had played Richard III at a private theatre performance some years before.
How about you, sir?
Meanwhile, the lady was in grave danger.
Now I have you, my lady.
No! I think not, sir.
Having a sword thrust at her heart by the sky-blue gentleman, the lady stepped neatly aside, snatched the weapon from his hand and ran him through to the hilt, pinning him to the wall panelling.
With renewed vigour, Jack now set to the plum-coloured fellow. Jack plunged the old rapier into the very centre of a large red flower in the other gentleman's waistcoat, nailing him neatly beside his friend. Both jerked their arms and legs about like a pair of toy shop puppets.
The coach! The coach! We may yet escape.
She threw her arms around Jack's neck.
May escape? Why, my dear, there's nobody else to kill, is there?
We have not an instant to lose. He is the only son of the powerful Marquis of Folletterville.
Well then, my dear, I'm afraid he'll never come to the title. You have cut him off in his prime.
I have been torn from my home and my friends by these villains. In another hour, that wretch would have forced me to marry him by violence. As you may guess from what you have seen, they were prepared for murder if I appealed to anyone for assistance. If their accomplices find us here, we are lost. Another 2 minutes may be too late. The mail coach!
They ran to the house door. There stood the coach with 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black horses ready harnessed. But no coachman, no guard, or even ostler to the horses' heads.
You will never leave me?
Never!
My dear protector. My dear, kind, brave protector.
Don't.
Why?
Because your mouth looks so beautiful when you speak, I'm afraid I shall be rude enough to kiss it.
Listen, those are wheels and horses.
So they are.
We are pursued.
Jack made up his mind at once. Lifting the lady into the coach, he mounted to the driving box.
Stay, love.
What's the matter?
I want to speak with you. Only one word.
Must I get down?
Yes.
Jack descended from his perch in a twinkling.
What is it, my dear?
Will you never love anyone but me? Never marry anyone beside?
I swear.
She drew in her head and pulled up the window. Jack jumped on the box and squared his elbows. Adjusting the reins, he seized the whip, giving one flick of it to the lead horse. Away flew the 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black beasts, with the old mail coach bouncing behind them. The noise behind grew louder. The faster they went, the faster came the pursuers. Men, horses, dogs, all in pursuit. The noise grew frightful, but above it all, Jack heard a lone, urging voice.
Faster! Faster!
They whirled past the dark trees like feathers swept before a hurricane. Houses, gates, churches, haystacks, and objects of every kind shot by. The speed and noise was as if roaring waters were suddenly let loose. But Jack heard only one thing.
Faster! Faster!
Our hero plied whip and rein, and the horses flew onward till they were white with foam.
Go on, my beauties!
Then suddenly, he heard a loud crack. Jack was pitched violently forward, and the world went black.
When he awoke abruptly, it was grey morning. Jack leapt quickly to his feet, reaching for his newfound sword to defend. But he had no sword.
My lady! My lady!
He was back in the wheelwright's yard on the box of an old Edinburgh mail coach. And it was bitterly cold. He got down and looked eagerly inside the coach for the beautiful young lady. But there was neither door nor seat to the coach. It was a mere empty shell.
Of course, Jack knew very well that there was a huge mystery in what had occurred to him. But he was resolute that everything really had happened, as he related these events to his friends afterwards.
Will you never love anyone but me? Never marry anyone beside?
For the rest of his life, Jack remained true to the great oath he had sworn to the beautiful young lady, refusing several eligible ladies on her account. At the last, he died a bachelor.
My dear, kind, brave protector.
But he always said to his friends what a curious thing it was that he should have discovered something so amazing by just clambering over a fence one windy Edinburgh morning.
The ghosts of mail coaches are in the habit of making journeys every night.
Down, 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 down. Down among the dead men, let him lie.
In the story of Jack Martin and his magical Scottish coach journey, narrator 1 was played by Lisa Nightingale, narrator 2 by Jim Newbury, Jack Martin by Danny Scott. The Guard was also played by Jim Newbury, Nasty Gentleman 1 by Mike Smith, Nasty Gentleman 2 by Mike Aries, and The Young Lady by Emma Willits. It was adapted for radio by Jim Newbury, and all audio, sound effects and soundscapes were created by Robbie Burgess. This was an Old Dolly Peoplescope production.
Love and wine their rights maintain, and their united pleasures reign. While Bacchus treasures crowns aboard, will sing the joy that both afford. And they that won't with us comply, down among the dead men, down among the dead men, down, 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 down. Down among the dead men, let them lie.